Okay. All right. Can you hear me, cousin? I think I got a few folks coming on here. See, I'm up to 5. All right, she can hear me, so I'm good to go. Good evening, everyone. Just want to be able to see, is Keith on here? What's up, niece? I think. All right, we're getting folks slowly coming on here. Yeah, for some reason I must have had a different version of Facebook than what he had. I'm a Zoom expert, so this Facebook stuff is kind of new to me. But we're glad to have you join us. He already sent me the questions beforehand, so we'll miss the dialogical nature of it with him asking the question and me responding. But I have the questions. I've thought through them, so I think you're going to get a lot out of this. So we're just glad to have you hopping on with us. It's a lot going on in this nation. It's been a lot that's happened over the course of 2020. So I just think there's some things that God has laid on my heart that I think can help shine some light on some of these things that are happening and kind of give us some things to think about and to consider as we go forward. So glad to have you all hopping on and joining with us. I think I'm gonna wait one more minute, and I apologize for the tech glitches. I'm really adept at Zoom, and so Facebook Live is one of these newer mediums and platforms that I have to make sure to get up to speed on, because this is the wave of the future. One of the critical and creative ways we have to share knowledge. So hop on here with us. I think a few people have already started a watch party. So my host and my brother-in-law, Keith Hairston, is on here, who invited me to do this. And I do want to give thanks for him and my sister, Stephanie, for the invitation and the opportunity to kind of spend some time sharing with you. And basically the theme of tonight's forum and discussion really kind of focuses on this word disruption, because that's what we're experiencing. We're experiencing a moment and a time where things have been disrupted. Now, conventional wisdom, and a lot of people like to think that these disruptions this is something that's negative. This is a bad thing, and we need to squelch this. We need to put a stop to the disruption so that things can go back to normal. But I want you to rethink that position. If you kind of follow in the school of thought that, oh yeah, this is a disruption, this is not a good thing, and we kind of need to do something about this. I just want you to think about the possibility that God actually wants to use this disruption to do something constructive and positive in this country. Because again, we tend to just want things to be easy. But if there's injustice, if people are suffering, and people have been crying out to God for help and crying out to their sisters and brothers, and their cries are not being heard. It reaches kind of a critical point, where a tipping point, where something has to be done. And so we see, even in the biblical tradition, okay, the Israelites were suffering for over 400 years. They were crying out to God, and the Egyptians had plenty of time, to kind of come to the conclusion that what they were doing was wrong. Okay, that they were building an empire on the backs of the enslaved. Okay, it never occurred to them that they kind of need to make some changes in public policy, in laws, and how they were treating these slaves, and how abusive they were. You have the taskmasters whipping them, beating them, controlling them, using their labor to create wealth for the Egyptians. So the Israelites were crying out to God. And, I don't know why, but God can be patient with nations as they do things that are unjust. And so the Israelites kept crying out to God, and finally it just reached a point where God says, I'm going to disrupt what's going on in Egypt. So he calls a man named Moses, and Moses creates, this huge disruption in Egyptian culture that came in the form of 10 plagues. And by the end of that plague, that system of enslavement had been completely toppled. So the point of the story is to show you that sometimes God will use disruptions to do things that are positive, and maybe we need to kind of consider what possibly God could be up to in the moment in which we find ourselves. So thank you again, Keith Hairston. I want to open up with a word of prayer, and then we'll begin. God, thank you for this moment and this time that you have given us through the medium of technology to be able to share. You said in your word that wisdom is the principal thing. Get wisdom, and in all thy getting, get an understanding. I pray, God, amidst a time of great confusion, that you would give me words of wisdom, that people may understand the times in which we live, that they may be discerning, that they may look beyond the surface to the deeper realities that have bubbled up and have exploded in our streets. Give us ears to hear, and anoint our eyes that we may see, not just today, but in the days, the weeks, the months, and the years that lie before us. This is your time, and I yield it to you and ask for your guidance. Be with us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so the first question my brother-in-law posed to me is the big question. Is racism alive and well today? And so what we're going to do is we're going to have basically three moves. The first move, we're going to start really kind of broadly thinking about racial issues. Then we'll shift gears and just spend a little time thinking specifically about recent protests and kind of how to compare what's happening today with maybe some things that have happened before. And then we'll end with what are some steps that we can take, what are some things that we can do going forward. So those are kind of, so I bracketed basically, he's asked me two questions, and I bracketed two questions for each move, so that you kind of begin with just some understanding of what is racism. Then let's think about protests, and then what can we do? So with the first question, is racism alive and well? My answer is yes, okay? And one of the reasons racism is such a controversial and such a taboo topic is because really people don't know what racism is. All right, so I want to help you just for a few moments, and those of you who are probably listening, especially my friends, yeah, you know. But I'm talking about the mass of American citizens. We're rarely ever on the same page when the topic of racism comes up, because racism is not something that has been taught in our public schools from kindergarten on through college. Now, if you are a white American, you can go from kindergarten to getting a PhD, and never have to study what racism is, the effects of racism, the history of slavery, Jim Crow. You could be completely oblivious to these things. Okay, I've had people on my dissertation committee who were accomplished scholars who did not read books by black people. Okay, could not have an informed conversation with me about the history of slavery and racism. And here I was, a doctoral student, really teaching them because they didn't know. And honestly, many don't even feel the need to know. So one of the reasons we don't understand racism is because, number one, it's not on the radar. So if you're gonna understand racism, the first thing you gotta do is you've got to differentiate racism from prejudice, okay? Now, one of the problems we have is when people hear that word racism, they think, are you trying to tell me you think that all white people are still prejudiced against black people? And my retort is, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Now, let's be honest. There are some white people who still hold prejudicial or stereotypical views about African Americans. Now, I'm not for 1 second going to say that has gone away, because it has not. But that's not what we're talking about when we talk about racism is alive and well. I want to read just a little excerpt from a little book I wrote that's entitled Hope on the Brink, Understanding the Emergence of Nihilism in Black America. And it's in the opening chapter where I spend some time explaining the important difference between prejudice and racism. Okay, so it says, it is important to clarify two matters: what I mean by racism and the different ways it affects African Americans. My understanding of racism is heavily influenced by the work of Beverly Tatum. Her classic study of racial identity, entitled Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, was one of the most influential books I read in seminary. Tatum introduces what I believe is the most common misunderstanding about racism, which is the belief that it is solely prejudice. For many, when they hear racism, they are thinking of racial prejudice. She defines prejudice as preconceived judgments or opinions, usually based on limited information, and she says everyone has prejudices, not because they want them, but rather because everyone is exposed to misinformation. She adds, prejudice is one of the inescapable consequences of living in a racist society. But when it comes to the issue of racism, Tatum argues that it is better to understand racism as a system of advantage based on race. Now, great emphasis should be given to the idea of racism as a system and not prejudicial beliefs. So when my brother-in-law asked me the question, is racism alive and well? My answer is absolutely. Because what 246 years of slavery did in this country, okay, and slavery was a legal institution, all the way to the level of the federal government, all right, it was legal to enslave Africans. Okay, you're talking about cheap as in free labor for 246 years, all right? And watch this. Then when slavery was quote unquote unconstitutional, then the system morphs for another 103 years, starting with the black codes, sharecropping, convict leasing, and then you get Jim and Jane Crow segregation. Now, the system of Jim Crow, again, backed by the federal and state government, over 350 years of the history of this country, there have been legal obstacles to full citizenship, freedom, and equality for African Americans in this country. So you're not going to tell me that in less than in 50 years, you're going to fix all of that. Racism is alive and well because what slavery and Jim Crow did is that it gave white Americans social and structural advantages. So this is exactly why when you look at who are all the CEOs, who are the presidents of colleges and universities, who are on these boards, who runs banks, okay, that has to do with this history. Think about all of the institutions, in higher education. that were started during the era of slavery. I have them listed in a journal article that I wrote that I'm going to tell you about. Some of them are sitting on endowments in the millions and billions of dollars, and some of that money is linked to the transatlantic slave trade, linked to slavery, linked to wealthy plantation owners. I mean, many of the founding fathers of this country were slave owners who they learned how to amass wealth because they were slave owners. Then they leveraged that wealth to then write the founding documents of this country. Slavery is built into the fabric of this country. So you're not going to just undo that just because you say, oh, well, it ended in 1865. Well, let's keep talking about what else happened. Because again, there were legal impediments to citizenship and freedom for African Americans. So yes, racism is still alive and well, both at the structural level, because that's really what we're fighting. Okay, we're fighting that there are problematic policies, that the way we've structured this country is inequitable, and we need to fix it so that there's real equality. And then we also have some problems with people who have these prejudicial beliefs. Okay, and that is on display right now. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The second question that my brother-in-law wanted to ask me was why now? Like, why have we seen this kind of resurgence of racial animus? Well, I think that's complicated. Now I'll begin by saying I don't fully know why all this stuff is happening. I do know that when Senator Barack Obama was running for president, okay, I was like, this dude does not stand a chance. America's not going to elect an African American to be president of the United States. Okay, and I mean, I was adamant that's not going to happen. Okay, maybe America will elect an African American president if he's a Republican, maybe, but not a Democrat. This dude wins. Okay, I was blown away, and I was happy, and I voted for it too. But I was really surprised, and people start getting all worked up, like, oh man, I think we're in a new historical moment. We are in a post-racial period. We've moved beyond race, and African American is in the White House. And I can remember watching the inauguration live and seeing that smooth brother sitting up there getting ready to take the oath of office. It was something to take in. I mean, I was really, really taken aback and kind of caught up in the moment myself and was thinking, maybe we have entered into a new era. Woo, new. Now, when you study the history of this country, I want to introduce you to an important term that I think you should add to your vocabulary. Anytime African Americans experience some kind of modicum of progress, when they experience some kind of breakthrough, there is this thing called white backlash. There is this kind of a virulent backlash to something. So anytime, we'll make a breakthrough with something, there will be just this wave of white obstinance that would kind of hit us. So in '63, when King gave his, he led the March on Washington, he gave his I Have a Dream speech. Time votes him the Man of the Year. Tremendous amount of momentum. The movement is really starting to affect change. Next year, you get the passing of the Civil Rights Act of '64, and boy, after the Civil Rights Act of '64 hit, you had the summer of '64, which was white backlash. Okay, the Klan experienced a resurgence. There was riots in the streets. I mean, it was bad. Summer of '64. Go study it. All right, and that's just one example that anytime there's progress, there's pushback, and Obama triggered something in this country, and I'm not saying that's his fault, no, but he triggered something deep in this country where people felt that there was something fundamentally wrong with having that black man and that black woman and those black kids in the White House. And people start coming out the closet with some of this ugly stuff that we thought we were way past that. And we come to find out that we're not past that, okay? So everything from this man is a gorilla, an ape. Wait a minute, some of these old racist tropes from Jim Crow was still around in America. So, some of that was just the backlash from having this brother in the White House, that people have kind of felt emboldened. You've had the Tea Party and then Make America Great. where there is this desire to want to dial American culture back to the way that it used to be. I think also on a deeper level, the reason we've seen this resurgence in racism is because we have not been vigilant. We have not been vigilant. We have not been honest in dealing with what I call, what's the term I use? Covert racism. All right. So instead of white churches knowing they have a bad history when it comes to slavery and Jim Crow segregation, okay, most of the time they were on the wrong side of history. So instead of saying they're sorry about that history, they should have been doing really some hard work, some really hard internal work within themselves and within their churches, so that these things don't happen again. Because they didn't do that hard kind of internal work, that covert racism just kind of stayed around. And then all of a sudden, you start having these forces converge. African American in the White House, people starting to feel a little more emboldened to say things. The influence of Christianity has been in decline since the late 80s. So, people, there are less anchors, there are less, reins and restraints on some of this nonsense. And so we have kind of been going downhill, and we've really just seen this outright explosion. And African Americans have, in many respects, been under attack for the past 12 years. So someone tried to run over me with a van last week. I was just out walking, okay? And so people are just, they just are in a completely different place. And so I think the reasons that these things are happening, I think is a little complex, but I think, it's the symbolism of the Obama administration. It's a lot of this hard work that we have not been doing as a country, and particularly as people of faith. I think the moment in which we are in has completely exposed the church. Okay, the church is just exposed right now, and we really have to. I think we've got some important decisions to be making about what this moment means for us now, and then some steps that we need to take going forward. Another question then is really understanding. Okay, people are out here protesting. I mean, why are they protesting? I mean, are you okay, Dr. Brogdon? I mean, you're a college professor. I mean, people shouldn't be protesting. Well, I'm gonna say it like this. And if my nieces could help their uncle out, or my daughters, I think they're both on here, and if they could just put those little graphics that I sent them into the chat box, I would appreciate it. And because I'm doing a couple of these talks, I'll be at Campbellsville University on tomorrow. So one of the things I like to tell audiences, particularly my white brothers and sisters who are kind of wary about protests and disruption, I'll tell them this: if it wasn't for protest movements, if it wasn't for people who were willing to disrupt the normal, we would still be either in slavery or under the system of Jim Crow segregation. All right. The only reason that I am not in slavery is because there were people who were willing to put it on the line. There were people who were willing to say, we're not going to accept this system anymore. Okay, this has been 200 plus years. There's not some huge groundswell of white Americans who are saying, man, this slavery stuff is wrong. We've got to end this system. Okay, let's stop this. No, they were, most of them were okay with blacks being slaves. All right. And what you had is you had enough blacks who said, this is enough of this. And then you had whites with conscience who then allied themselves and began to really disrupt and to challenge that system. And then, of course, you have a huge disruption that's called the Civil War. And then that system comes crashing down. But so without disruption, there's slavery. All right. Same thing with Jim Crow segregation. Again, you're not, yes, King and many of the other leaders led massive protests and massive movements. But by and large, most people were okay with that system. But the people who led the freedom struggle, the folks who were part of the sit-ins, the freedom rides, man, they were creating disruptions. And the people in the 50s and the 60s did not like that either. And so what I want to ask people who have problems with protest today, you know, well, would you have had a problem with King and the Montgomery bus boycott? Would you have had a problem with the march from Selma to Montgomery? Because they were creating trouble. They were creating disruptions. You know how many times King was arrested? Okay. But what they were trying to do was they were trying to dramatize and expose this system before the world to show the world this is wrong. And it's sad that it comes to that. But many times people who are privileged, people who are, you know, it doesn't, you know, what is affecting the masses of blacks doesn't affect them. So there's no moral compunction to want to challenge this system. And so people have to lay their lives down. Every day of King's life while he was a part of the struggle, he had to make peace with the fact that that could be the last day he lived, because he was constantly getting death threats. We're gonna kill you, we're gonna kill you, we're gonna bomb your house. I mean, bombs going off, bombs being thrown into his home, not going off. I mean, the real stuff. But they had to disrupt these things to then create these systems of change. So let me give you Dr. Brogdon's definition of protest, all right, because I believe it's going to help you. My definition is protests seek to reveal injustice and to disrupt our normal way of life to create change. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen. Now protests are messy. I'll talk a little bit about that. But what people are trying to do is they're trying to say that what happened to George Floyd, what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, what happened to Breonna Taylor. Now, this needs to be exposed, because there's this tendency to want to cover this stuff up. But in the example of the murder of George Floyd, I mean, this officer just down on his neck, just very casually, because he knows the system is really going to protect him. And so people are protesting because they're trying to pull the covers off of this and say, nah, y'all need to stop hiding this stuff. And this stuff is madness. This stuff has to stop. So the only way, we've tried talking, we've tried, we've got all these black intellectuals out here, myself included. We spend all this time writing books, talking, writing books and talking, writing books and talking, and people, kind of nodding their head, that's interesting, yeah, that's okay, and they don't do anything. So now you got people who say, no, we got to disrupt this stuff so as to provoke change. And so my question to you when you're thinking about protests is, are you going to be a part of the folks who are on the wrong side of history? Because there were folks who were defending slavery in the 1800s. They were fighting to say slavery's God's will. Africans are, they're supposed to be enslaved. That's kind of their God-ordained duty. Now we look back on them and like, oh, man, they were completely off. And many of my white friends, if I lived back during the days of slavery, I would be fighting it. Okay. All right. If I would be marching with Martin, if I was back then. Oh, okay. Now we have a massive system affecting the lives of African Americans today. It's twofold. It's economic injustice and it's mass incarceration. The way blacks are policed, our criminal justice system is completely bankrupt. Look at the data on sentencing, okay? The darker your skin are, the worse your sentence is going to be. What's up with that? Blacks have the same amount of wealth that we had when we came out of slavery. 2%. How can 13% of the population not even have 13% of the wealth? We've got 2% of the wealth. The masses of black people, get your eyes off of Oprah and Tyler Perry and Michael Jordan and LeBron James. The masses of black people are poor, okay? And I saw a statistic today that because of the rate of unemployment due to the coronavirus, almost half the black community, they're unemployed right now. I mean, you're talking about, we're a very vulnerable demographic of people. Because of course, slavery and Jim Crow, that stuff is real. So are you going to be on the right side of history? Are you going to be protesting? And there's lots of different ways to protest. Everybody don't have to be walking up and down the streets. Or are you going to be on the sidelines or on the wrong side of history? Now let's shift gears a little bit to just do a little comparative work between what we're seeing with the recent protests versus kind of what has come before us with the freedom struggle. And I think there's lots of similarities there. I think you have this history of violence that you can look at during the Jim Crow era. There's lots of similarities with that today. I mean, Ahmaud Arbery he was just jogging, and I mean, he was hunted down and he was killed. You had stuff like that happening during the civil rights movement. I mean, it really reminds me of the lynching of Emmett Till. So there's this ugly history of racial violence against African Americans that was a part of the civil rights movement. It goes all the way back to the centuries of slavery. These things are still happening today. I mean, this man who was driving this van last week just felt I was just another nigger, okay, and that he could take my life. He didn't care that I'm an ordained minister. He doesn't care if I have a PhD, that I've written 7 books, that I'm a good father. Okay, no, I'm just another black person, and the world will be better off without me. Okay, and so he felt just emboldened to just try to run into me. All right, and so yes, there are some similarities. Okay, I mean, I'm terrified at the thought of my 2 black sons being pulled over by a police officer. And I should not have to live in a country this way. I should not be, and I mean, I am terrified at the thought of a police officer ever pulling over one of my black sons. Because depending on the kind of day he's had, okay, he may just be like feeling like, you know what, I think I'm just gonna do something, okay? And we always think it's someone else, but it can be us. It could be my sons, it could be my daughters, it could be your sons, your daughters. And we shouldn't have to live in this kind of country. And so I think there are some similarities. And so Dr. King and many others, what they were trying to do was they were trying to expose these things. They were trying to use what he calls nonviolent direct action to create confrontation. And King protested with an agenda in mind. Okay, there was some kind of policy, some kind of program, some kind of law that needed to be passed that he was thinking specifically about. Many times he had fantastic recommendations that went nowhere, but the fact that he wanted to put the plans with the protests was very important, and that's what we need to do today. King believed that there should be a cabinet level position that dealt with black affairs. Okay, and I mean, wow, imagine if there was a cabinet level position, irregardless of the party. It's their responsibility to really handle diversity issues in this country that has a ugly history when it comes to people of color. All right, Native Americans, African Americans, okay, Japanese and Chinese, they've all had major problems being integrated into American society. So I think there's some wonderful similarities there. He wanted to ask about, do I believe that there are people who get planted in these protests to kind of disrupt and to really get into the looting? Protests are messy, okay? Lots of emotions. When it comes to when something happens and it boils to a head and people take to the streets, you're talking about a lot of emotion. And the Bible talks about be angry but sin not. And so I think what's important is that there is a legitimate space for anger. So you can kind of be upset about something that is not right. But then, of course, the balance is in, making sure that your anger doesn't tip over into something that is harmful. Now, the mainstream, just really the masses of African Americans, they're protesting to want to bring awareness that there have been lynchings in this country, 3 of them in the past few months, and that they're tired of it, okay? And that we need to do something about policing, we need to do something about sentencing, okay? And I mean, we need to do something substantive, because this stuff has been going on for years. Now, there are fringe elements of every community. There are people in every community, they're not necessarily thinking about plans, they're just upset, okay? And so, you're gonna have the looting, the violence. And what that does is that then detracts attention away from some of these central and core issues. That's inevitable. It's inevitable when the police is so militarized and they're coming into these spaces, many times provoking confrontations and acting violently. And so it's a powder keg. So it's a lot going on. But I will say that there are members of the white community who are coming into these spaces, and they're being very, very deceptive, very antagonistic, and they're doing stuff in a violent way to make protests look a certain way. And I hope my white brothers and sisters really pay attention to that, because it's like, oh, I'm for the protest, but I'm not for the looting. Well, why are certain members of the white community coming into black communities and having a disruptive and a violent presence, and they're being caught on video doing these things? So I just think it's important to just see there's a lot of complexity there as it relates to, outsiders kind of coming in. I think it's in both and, but that's a great question, bro. So let's turn the corner. The last two questions are, what are some things that we can do? First, I want to encourage us. There's lots of different ways to protest. Please just don't be passive. Okay, we'll miss the momentum that I think is being created. So don't be passive. Don't be on the sidelines. So I'm a former jock. I used to be a basketball star in Bluefield, Virginia. Well, star in my own eyes. And man, there's nothing worse than sitting on the bench. Something that I didn't get a lot of experience of because I was pretty good. But you want to be out on the court. You want to be out where the action is happening. Now, some people, when it comes to social injustice and times of social crisis, man, they don't want to have nothing to do with it. They're fine on the sidelines. But look, and I need this from both my black brothers and sisters and my white brothers and sisters to get off the sideline. Now, I'm not saying everybody has to be marching up and down the street, because protest takes on a lot of different forms. Some of this educational and teaching work that I'm doing is my service, is my responsibility to the movement. And I haven't just been doing it now. I've been doing this stuff for years. That being an educator and doing educational advocacy and really advocating for African Americans in educational spaces, that's my calling. That's my responsibility. And so, that's some of the work that I'm doing in teaching so that people can understand each other. That's my responsibility. So protests can look a lot of different ways, but don't sit on the sidelines, and make sure that you find some ways to plug in and to get involved so that we do something with this moment that I think God has given us. I also want to encourage you to try to listen, okay? We're not going to think the same way. We're not going to agree, all right? But I think the moment is so hot that sometimes if we're not careful, we will find ourselves gnashing and lashing out at everybody, okay? Sometimes even people that we need. So just be careful. We are going to see some things differently. Let's try to find some ways to listen to each other, to foster understanding, so that we can find some ways that we can move ahead together. I also want to say this, and this is just coming from somebody who again has, some background as a religious leader and as a religious thinker. You folks on social media who's telling everybody, if you're silent, it's complicity. And I know you mean well, but some folks who don't know what to say are starting to feel pushed to say stuff that doesn't need to be said, okay? Just because you feel like saying something doesn't mean that needs to be said. It's kind of like that verse in the Bible that says, let's be quick to hear and slow to speak. All right, so when we say silence is complicity, we're really talking about staying on the sidelines. All right, everybody don't need to be talking right now, because some folks, the stuff they are saying is rooted in ignorance, deception, confusion, all right, and hatred, all right? And sometimes what you need to do, instead of open up your mouth, open up those ears and open up your heart, all right? And maybe say, what can I learn from what's going on? Maybe, if you are a Christian, the Bible teaches us compassion. What is compassion? It is to try to walk in someone else's shoes. So if people are hurting and you turn off what the New Testament calls the bowels of your compassion. How can you say God's love is in you? If people are hurting and you try to act indifferent, then don't go to church. Please don't. Okay? Because, I mean, you're completely going against what it means to be a Christian. A man asked Jesus, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? He says, what does what does Torah tell you? What does the law tell you? He says, love God and to love your neighbor. Jesus said, well, do this and live. Again, he says, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus says, well, I'm glad you asked. He told him the story of the Good Samaritan. And in this story, you had this man who fell among the thieves, and the religious folks did not help, but it was the one who the Jews hated, the Samaritans, who was the hero in the story because he took the time to help this person who needed him. And he ministered to him. And he took of his privilege and his resources to make sure this person was taken care of. Jesus pointed to what the Samaritan did as the example of love. So if your brothers and sisters are out here trying to say Black Lives Matter, then what you need to do is to try to understand that, not trying to shut them down with your retort that all lives matter, which makes no sense if you think it through. Okay? People who are being choked out by the cops are trying to say we matter. A little kid who has a toy gun can't even play in the park without a cop rolling up on him and executing him. You can't understand why people who have been enslaved, Jim Crow, dogs sicked on them, hoses put on them, why they would feel like their lives don't matter in this country. Now, my Native American brothers and sisters, I don't hear them ever saying all lives matter because they understand where we're coming from, because they've walked that same ugly trail that we've walked. And so some of the things we could do is to really listen to each other, because I think if we listen to each other, God can use that empathy to create these kind of partnerships and coalitions that are going to lead to programs, policies, and laws that are going to address and correct these injustices. Last thing, and I'm finished. My brother-in-law wanted me to share with you some resources that can help you, especially if you don't have the language, you don't have the knowledge of the history to even be able to enter into this discussion. This is one reason why I don't waste a lot of time arguing on social media with people who are look, if they don't even understand the history of slavery, what are you going to be talking with them about? All it's going to be is just tit-tat, tit-tat, tit-tat all over the place. All right, because people have been miseducated in this country. So I want to introduce you to some sources that I think that can kind of help just give some context to this history. And before you maybe want to hop on social media and castigate the people who are protesting, I challenge you over the next month to read 7 books. 7 books. Any 7 of these books that I'm going to show you, I dare you to read them, because I think it'll change your life. I think if you're open-minded and open-hearted, and you just spend some time sitting with historical facts and straight-up data, just straight data, I don't see how you can walk away and say we don't have a problem in America. This book is called Lynching in America, Confronting the Legacy of Racial Terror. It's put out by the Equal Justice Initiative. I mean, if you haven't been down to the Lynching Museum in Alabama, you need to go. And if you're interested, I may want to take a group of people this summer down to the Lynching Museum so you can see it for yourself. Because lynching is something that has been completely hidden from our national consciousness. Over 5,000 people have been lynched. And these lynchings were attended by thousands upon thousands of whites. Some of your parents and grandparents attended lynchings. They're probably ashamed that they were there. Okay, this stuff went on for years. Racial terror, and it's still happening. And you need to see the data on it, because until you understand lynching, then you won't understand some of the problems we have with our criminal justice system. So that's a helpful resource. There's a book by Randall Robinson called The Debt, What America Owes to Blacks. Powerful story that really takes you on kind of an intellectual and an emotional journey. of an African-American leader who loves this country, but struggles with the history and how these things affect us. There's a book out called The Burden that's edited by Rochelle Riley. It's called The Burden, African Americans and the Enduring Impact of Slavery. That's by Rochelle Riley. You need to get that one. A classic is called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, that really deals with the whole issue of mass incarceration. And I will also add to this, Michelle Alexander, you need to look at the documentary 13th on Netflix. And it'll show you there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment that says slavery is unconstitutional unless you've been committed of a crime. So criminalizing blacks will be the new way to still enslave them. So it's very, very important. Thomas Shapiro's work on the hidden cost of being African American deals with the whole issue of wealth inequality. Very, very good read. Full of data. He talks about, where you end up in life has a lot to do with where you start. And where African Americans start, they start from a place of deficiency because of wealth inequities, not just income. You got to pay attention to wealth. One of the standards in critical race theory is called Portraits of White Racism by David Wellman. Portraits of White Racism. He really was instrumental into sociological work in helping to shift our thinking about racism away from prejudice to it being a system of advantage and a system that disadvantages blacks. All right, and then he shows you the complex ways whites will try to rationalize why that's okay. It is worth the read. The book, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. You really need to get this book. Okay, it'll dip you into the world of finance to show you the inequities in the banking field. You need to know about redlining, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Really kind of gets you into how cities and local municipalities, oh my gosh, would discriminate against blacks when it comes to housing. The way they would mark off certain cities and certain boundaries. This is why when you go to major urban areas across the country, it's the same pattern, man. You got places where whites live that are nice, and then you got these places where the poor blacks live. That was done on purpose. It's called redlining. Look it up. The American Non-Dilemma, Racial Inequality Without Racism, Nancy D. Tomaso. She talks about opportunity hoarding, okay? So again, what it's doing is teaching you how to think structurally, all right? We're not worried about the fact that you don't like black people. No, what we're about are these systems. So people hire people who are like them. And instead of being honest about that, you trying to deny that it's all based on opportunity and if black people would just work hard, when we know that a lot of times it's a good old boys club. Slavery by Another Name really gets you to understand that even after slavery, right, this is talking about convict leasing, that they would use the criminal justice system. They would just come up with these whack charges, arrest blacks, and then basically re-enslave them. And this stuff was going on right up until World War II. If you want to learn how to be an ally, I want to encourage you to read my friend's book, Dr. Shannon Craig O'Snell and Christopher Dussault. The book is called No Innocent Bystander, Becoming an Ally in the Struggle for Justice. I was one of the persons that interviewed for this. And one of the things I said in this book is if you want to be an ally, then you need to understand, you need to educate yourself. And you have to decenter yourself to understand that your experience is not the only experience in America. That other people have had different kinds of experiences. And if you just for a moment will entertain the possibility that somebody else has had a different experience, a painful one, a violent one, an exploitative one, and your heart can go out to us, man, we can build something together. And then the last book is what is the definitive study on the issue of reparations. It's called From Here to Equality by William Darity and A. Kirsten Mullen. From Here to Equality. Darity and Mullen shows that if we would have did reparations right at the end of the Civil War, America would be a completely different place. But they didn't. Okay? And so I think these are some great resources. I want to encourage you to also go online to Christian Ethics Today, and you can look up these 2 special editions that deal with the Angela Project. Christian Ethics Today. Just look it up online. One volume came out in spring 2018, the other one the spring of 2019. I'll take you in deep, looking at issues of education, looking at issues of inequality, and I think it can help you. You can also try out my YouTube channel and watch my documentary that's called Slavery in Black and White, A Local Look. It kind of shows you what it's like for people in a local community to address the legacy of slavery. So I think those are some helpful resources. I appreciate your time. Sorry for all of the technical difficulties, but if anybody has some questions they would like to briefly ask me, put it in the chat box. Okay, I see some now. And let me see, my sister's asking me a question here. Do I see an option? Sadly, sis, I don't. And I would love for my bro to jump in here. Jonathan asked, do we need a Moses in 2020? I would say, I think we're beyond the historical moment where we can have a sort of great singular leader. I think we need a collegium. I think we need a college of Black leaders, a Black think tank that's very, very broad and very, very diverse, that can address the array and constellation of issues. I think the Black community, we have to think structurally. So when I'm teaching my students in the HBCU setting at Simmons, I'm teaching them, we have to, and this was Carter Woodson's problem with the system of education when he wrote the book, The Miseducation of the Negro. Black people are not educated to solve our own problems. We are educated to solve everyone else's problems. And being successful means, can we go into white space and solve their problems and build up their community? Okay, that's the reality. That's what integration did to us. We lost our infrastructure. So we're trying to piece together. We have to, as a community, we have to build an infrastructure. And in order to do that, we have to have a different model of leadership. We've got to get out of the sort of mono, singular leader, and we really have to start thinking collegially and collectively about some of these things. Great question. Let me see here. Any other questions? Now, I need to put my niece Simone. You have to ask me a question, so you better type one in there. Okay, my sister, what can white pastors do to help? Create educational spaces in your churches, in your home, in your community organizations for education. I think that's a helpful place to start. You know, get someone like myself, man. There are leaders all over this country who, man, God has called us to this. Teaching this history and helping people to kind of understand what happened so that we together can imagine what are some things that we can do differently going forward. But the reason we can't develop effective coalitions is because we're not having the same conversations. So a lot of times we're talking about structural and systemic issues, and whites are feeling attacked, you know, wanting to ward off white guilt because you try to say that all white people are racist. And we're like, no. We're talking about there are these structures that's connected to this history that's still affecting us, and we need you to help. Okay, this is how the American system works. People are privileged, people who are underprivileged, and we need to make it where it's this. And it's not going to happen overnight, but we need partners who can help us to build this kind of world. That was the world King was envisioning when he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And because he got so much pushback when he started talking about racial equality, he says, my dream became a nightmare. Because what he realized was white conservatives never even want to have a conversation, and all white progressives want to do is they just want to talk and give lip service and not really try to create a different kind of society, which is why in his final work, Where Do We Go From Here, he says we need a revolution of values. And that's what we need in this country. That's what the protests are about. We have to change our values. This hatred and the violence in this country is going to be our ruin. Okay, my niece has a question. What kind of protest is effective nowadays? I think a lot. I think the protests we're seeing in the streets, that's a beautiful thing. It's very, very effective, and the fact that people are persisting. I think what we need to think about is how do we organize it better, so that we're saying, okay, we're protesting, but here is the outcome. We're doing this because here's what we want. Yes, we want to be heard. Yes, we want to draw attention to these issues, but there's also something really specific in mind that we want. So there are groups who are working with the mayor, and they will make specific recommendations. The mayor say, well, I can't do that. They say, well, we're going to keep protesting. All right. And I think that's very effective. I think educating, that's an effective thing to do. Because really you need to understand the nuances of this system, so that when we're developing proposals, they can really do something. We just can't raise our voice and say something's wrong. We have to really be thinking about outcomes. Right? So this is the dean in me, because I do assessment work as well. It has to always be about what do we want, which is why a collegium of leaders could really be effective to say, look, there are some things from an economic standpoint. There's some things with the system of mass incarceration and the way we educate people. I think we need to change these things. That, to me, that would be a nice start. My sister says, can you tell us more about the 6-part series on racism? Oh, okay. Yes, thank you. So the seminary I'm a professor at, Baptist Seminary of Kentucky, we've decided to launch, in response to all this, a 6-part series. That's really dealing with this. Now, the Baptist Seminary of Kentucky is a unique theological institution. It has a campus on a predominantly white college, and a campus in the city of Louisville downtown in what Dr. Cosby calls black space. And BSK decided years ago that they needed to be in black space. And I don't know of any predominantly white seminary that's ever made the intentional move to come into black space. And they didn't come into black space saying, well, here's how y'all should really run this school. They came into black space listening, finding what can we do to partner together. They came to learn, they came to serve, and it's been a beautiful relationship. And out of the synergy of Dr. David Cassidy and Dr. Kevin Cosby working together, you know, I've had the opportunity to serve as the provost at Simmons, as well as to be on the faculty at BSK. So it's just been wonderful to kind of be a part of that. So this 6-part series starts June the 16th. It's Tuesday nights. Go to bsk.edu, look up the Flourish, and I think the link has been included in the chat box. And Dr. Laura Levins and myself, we are facilitating it. You're going to be able to study each week with a different BSK professor who's going to give you a different angle on it, whether it's from the biblical tradition, whether it's history, theology, Black church studies. You know, that's my area. So please avail yourself to that. It is only $39, but space is limited. So do make sure you hop on and avail yourself to that. Man, it just warms my heart to see all y'all folks on here. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Okay. My niece, she's on a roll. I told her she's my justice warrior. I like that. She says, so many non-blacks are being offended and uncomfortable. Is it bad to not take time to educate and enlighten all of them? Simone, that's very complicated. Let me tell you about another book. The book is called White Fragility. White Fragility. Now, let's just say you have a white friend who's kind of got their feathers ruffled with all of this happening. You thought that they were really down for you. And then all of a sudden, these protests happen. There's this pain black people are experiencing. They don't understand it. And instead of making it about the pain that blacks are feeling, they make it about themselves. So you may want to operate in some wisdom and not get into a tit for tat kind of argument, because you don't know how productive that's going to be. Just maybe say, I'd like to share a resource with you. Maybe if you could just, read some of this, and maybe we could circle back around and talk about it. And so order the book, White Fragility. I think it's a helpful way for whites to kind of have an internal conversation with themselves, because it was written by a white person. To kind of talk about just how anytime you want to start having conversations about racism, whites just get all touchy about that, and we're talking about things, like somebody tried to kill me. We're not making this stuff up. All right. But there is this fragility, this hesitance to want to have these kinds of conversations. So sometimes a resource like that is a way to have an initial conversation that can maybe lead to some other conversations that maybe God can use to bring about some transformation and change. We have to be a little pastoral with each other, and to try to as the New Testament say, to try to forbear with each other. It's a tough task. But writing people off, throwing people away, maligning people, and insulting people, that is only going to lead, I think, to the collapse of this country. And that's the direction we're running towards. Okay? Because we think a house divided is going to stand. It is not. It's going to collapse. Any other questions before? And again, I want to thank my brother-in-law for doing this. And yes, my president, he included the link again. Thank you, Dr. Cassidy, so much. And it's awesome that you hopped on here, and Laura hopped on here as well. I got some great colleagues, that's for sure. All right, I think one of my Simmons students, let me see if there's a question at the very bottom. It's not showing up. Okay, yeah, just a pop affirmation. Friends, I love you. I hope some of this has been helpful. If there are any other ways that I can be of service, please do not hesitate to contact me. Yes, we need to continue to pray for this nation, but don't think for a moment that whispering a few prayers is going to address the complex history of slavery and Jim Crow segregation, mass incarceration in this country. We got to roll up our sleeves. We have to open up our hearts and our minds, and we have to go to work, because I want my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren to live in a better world than the one I'm living in now. I love you. We'll talk soon. Peace.